Edward John Payne, in the introduction of The Voyages of Drake and Gilbert, published in 1909, explained the circumstances that caused the loss of the Delight as follows. Quote, "When the ships were within 15 leagues of the island of Sablon, he came up to the Delight in his own light vessel, and consulted Clarke as to the course. Clarke unhesitatingly advised west-southwest, because the wind was in the south, the night at hand, and there were unknown sands stretching far out to the sea from the shore they were nearing. Gilbert, however, commanded him to go west-northwest. Clarke in vain represented that his own ship would be upon the sands before daylight. Gilbert angrily replied that Clarke must be out in his reckoning, and commanded him the Queen's name to do as he was bidden."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Grand Ambition of the Delight.
Here we are. Enjoy!
Though Richard Clarke's words proved to be prophetic about the fate of his ship, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who was in command of the voyage, was not a man who was inclined to listen to outside advice. Worse still, by the time they found themselves off of what was most likely Sable Island, Gilbert seemed to have felt a true desperation to prove himself to the men under him, as well as the rest of the world. They were going to be sailing back to England soon, and he would not be able to report the discovery of any great kingdoms on the shores of New England, or the discovery of the rumored grand city that was supposed to lay along the coast, with houses with pillars of silver and crystal. It was true that they had encountered people, but precious metals seemed to be in short supply. In 1578, Sir Gilbert received a charter that gave him the authority to discover and claim for himself, under the flag of England, quote, lands not actually possessed by any Christian prince or people for the next 6 years. That he was granted this charter was in no small part due to the funding and influence of his much more successful half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh. It was his intention to form a settlement somewhere to the north of Spain's holdings in Florida, but to the south of the already well-explored and chartered Newfoundland fisheries. If possible, it certainly would not hurt if he was able to find Norumbega, an area described at the time as a region lying between Cape Breton and the Jersey coast, with a capital city full of gold, silver, and other riches. The story of the wealthy capital of Norumbega had originally been told by David Ingram in 1568, a sailor who had been marooned by John Hawkins due to a lack of supplies on their ship, and who later written an account of his long walk from the Gulf of Mexico through Maine to the St. Johns River. He told of a vast and wealthy city named Bega in his story, though it is generally agreed by anyone who has read his account that he made many embellishments to appeal to public interest. That he walked through a large Native American village seems very likely. That the pillars of the houses there were made of precious metals seems less likely. Even if Gilbert did not find a northern El Dorado, he had written an entire essay on his belief in the existence of a Northwest Passage, the discovery of which would make him as wealthy as a city of gold, if he could lay personal claim to it. Gilbert's first attempt to make use of the charter in 1578 ended badly. They were only at sea for a short time when they lost one ship due to an encounter with Spanish ships, which their ships were not equipped to fight. The expedition was forced to limp back to England only a few days after leaving, and quickly descended into power struggles between the leaders and dissolved. Though Gilbert was prepared to make another attempt to use his charter immediately, he first received an order from the council that he could only sail again if he gave a bond for his good behavior, and then soon after, another message from the council telling him to abandon the voyage entirely or face the Queen's displeasure. It seems as though his first attempt had left a bad taste in the mouth of the government. It had also left Gilbert almost bankrupt. It was not until 1583 that he had scrapped up the funds, again with the help of his half-brother, and rebuilt confidence in the voyage enough to try again. The time on his charter was running out, and so he set sail from England with a need to prove himself, and a desperate need for this voyage to be a prosperous one, or he was going to face financial ruin once again. On June 11th, 1583, Gilbert set sail with 5 ships. The largest ship, at 200 tons, was named Raleigh, after its owner. Though it was the largest ship, since it was not Gilbert's, he instead took up residence on the second largest ship, a 120-ton ship named the Delight, though it was referred to as the Admiral or the George. The Golden Hind and Swallow were 40 tons, and finally there was the smallest ship in the group, a 10-ton ship named the Squirrel. Gilbert's command shrank by 1 fairly quickly, though. The Raleigh turned round only a couple of days into the voyage. The captain of the Raleigh announced that his men were very sick, but there does not seem to have been any evidence, and when he turned back it was without Gilbert's permission. Gilbert would write a letter back to England complaining that the Raleigh had abandoned him in broad daylight, and requesting that Sir Walter Raleigh punish the people who had turned back accordingly. Between the 4 remaining ships, there were now about 260 men who were instructed to meet up in St. John's, Newfoundland. They did all succeed in reaching St. John's, though the Delight ran aground entering the bay and had to be towed off by other ships. There were no reported damages as a result. Once he arrived in St. John's, Gilbert immediately gathered the fishermen and merchants of international origins who had also stopped over in St. John's, and declared to them that by Queen's decree, the land now belonged to the English, and, more importantly, to Sir Gilbert. Gilbert had thought that St. John would prove to be a good place to repair his ships after the voyage and resupply, but as soon as they reached land, some of his men immediately deserted. Many other men were sick or not survived the voyage. It was not a promising start. It would get worse. Gilbert had not been able to be picky about the character of the sailors who would be coming with him, and, while in St. John's, some of his men who had traveled on the Swallow were discovered trying to piratically take over the ships, while most of the officers were on shore. It was not the first piracy they had engaged in either. It was found that during the voyage across the Atlantic, the crew of the Swallow had also stripped a French fishing vessel of everything, and then left the sailors who had been her crew on a ship without food or canvas, and no hope of reaching the shore. On being discovered, some of the more piratical members of the crew of the Swallow stole a fishing vessel and escaped. It was decided to send the Swallow back to England with the members of the crew who were too sick to be of any use, or too insubordinate to be trusted. Among the people who were sent back to England was the captain who had been in command of the Delight. Captain Maurice Brown, who had been in command of the Swallow, was put in his place. The men under Gilbert's command had shrunk once again. While in St. John's, Gilbert also heard from a Saxon miner that he had found a silver mine, and Gilbert became determined to find it and claim it for his own. With this in mind, he transferred from the Delight to the Squirrel. The Delight had too deep of a draft, and he wanted to be able to sail into rivers and close to the shore in the hopes of finding even more rich deposits. On the 20th of August, they had resupplied everything they needed and done repairs, and the 3 ships set out again. They were hoping to find the livestock that had been abandoned in the region by a previous attempt to form a settlement. The 3 ships were now able to stick together, and they began to travel along the coast, rounding Cape Race, heading to Cape Breton, and occasionally going on shore to assess whether land would be good to settle on or not. A generally festive mood was reported for those days. The Delight had a band on board her, and they were employed to entertain everyone, while the crews were amazed by the large amount of fish they were able to catch. Richard Clarke, the master of the Delight, and William Cox, the master of the Golden Hind, would both report that they noticed signs of a storm coming in, and on the 29th of August, the gale hit. It was said that Gilbert had asked Clarke what course they should take, and then got angry with him when he did give advice and ordered him to do the exact opposite. Gilbert did have a reputation for a large amount of pride and a very unpleasant temper, so the story does not seem entirely unlikely. The wind was blowing strongly from the southeast, and it brought with it rain and a thick fog that limited visibility badly. The ships were in a terrible position for these conditions. They were surrounded by sandbars that Cox could only identify by looking for the breakers, and they were only able to advance by taking constant soundings. Cox, alarmed by the soundings that he was taking, immediately sent a signal to the Delight to go further out to the sea. As the largest ship left in their group, the Delight was in the greatest danger in their current situation. Unfortunately, the Delight either did not see the signal, or did not act on it soon enough. Only minutes after the Golden Hind had sent them the warning, the Delight was hard aground. In the rough seas, the Delight's stern was smashed to pieces quickly as the other two ships looked on in horror. They had no ability to come to the rescue of the men on the Delight, though. Any ship that got near to her position was likely to wreck as well. For the safety of their ships, the Golden Hind and the Squirrel departed the area quickly, going further from the land and abandoning those on board the swiftly disintegrating Delight to their fate. The Delight did have a small boat. They had used it the day before for collecting birds that had been shot from the ship. The problem was that they had neglected to bring it back on board, and had instead just towed it behind their ship. Several of the men on board who were confident in their ability to swim went after it, and brought the boat alongside the Delight with the hope of saving at least some of the people on board the wrecked ship. It was a difficult situation. There was no chance that the small boat would be able to save everyone on board the ship. In total, 16 or 17 men were lucky enough to find a place in the boat before they were forced to abandon the Delight. Among their number was not Captain Brown, even though the men on board the boat did their best to convince him to join them. He was not willing to face the shame of abandoning the ship he was in charge of, and stayed stubbornly in place, while exhorting the men around him to do what they could to save themselves. Rafts were built but were never seen again, presumably foundering in the rough seas. In total, an estimated 100 men were lost with the Delight. More than one person has argued this was their just punishment. Captain Brown and many of the other men on board the ship had come from the Swallow, which had left the French fishing vessel to its fate after committing their act of vicious piracy. That Gilbert's response to this had simply been a personnel shuffle did not sit well with many people, and they saw the fate of the Delight as justice done. It was not just the men from the Swallow who met their end, though. On board was also the Saxon miner who had reported the silver mine to Gilbert, and a poet named Stephanus Parmenius. Parmenius had enthusiastically come along on the voyage to write a classical-style poem in Latin, celebrating Gilbert's voyage and his discoveries. The fate of those who had managed to escape in the small boat, including Clarke, did not seem any more promising. The number of people on board was too much for the little boat. They did not have any supplies, and they only had a single oar. They also could not raise a sail because of how strong the seas were. One of the men suggested drawing lots, and the 4 people who drew the short straw should throw themselves overboard to lighten the load. He did say that this should exclude Clarke, since Clarke was the person best able to steer the vessel to safety. Clarke refused the entire idea, and put an end to the discussion, saying it would be better if they all shared the same fate, no matter what it was. The boat drifted on, entirely at the mercy of the wind and the waves. On the 5th day, one of the men suffering from hunger and thirst succumbed, and they had no choice but to send him overboard to lighten the boat. For 2 more days after that, they traveled as the wind would take them until they reached the southern part of Newfoundland. For their entire voyage, the wind had been southerly, which would have blown them away from land, but fortunately, it now shifted to the north, which brought them safely to shore. For 3 days, they rested on the shore, living off of berries and wild peas, which were abundant in the area. For 5 more days, they took their boat along the shoreline until they met with a Spanish ship called the St. John de Luz, which treated the castaways kindly and brought them to Biscay, where they returned to Europe. They were immediately greeted by members of the Spanish Inquisition when they arrived in Spain. And though the ship's captain helped them through the first round of questioning, the encounter spooked the men enough that they quickly snuck into France during the night, and from there reached England. In returning to England, they were more fortunate than Sir Humphrey Gilbert. When the Delight had been lost, it was noted that Gilbert flew into a rage. Not because of the loss of the men or the ship, but because on it was the silver ore samples that he had intended to bring back to England to ensure he would be able to gather investors in his next voyage. It was reported that he violently attacked the boy who had been responsible for putting the silver on his former flagship. There was no way for them to retrieve the silver, though, and so Gilbert was forced to turn back to England, hoping that he could convince investors that he knew where a silver mine was without any evidence. Many people have speculated about why it was that Gilbert decided to remain on board the 10-ton Squirrel, rather than transferring back to a larger ship for the voyage to England. Some of the theories put forward have been as follows: that the Squirrel was in such poor repair that the men on board her refused to travel any further in her if they were abandoned. Or that a rumor had started among the men of the expedition that Gilbert was actually afraid of the ocean, and that he stayed on the weakest ship to prove them wrong. Or that he believed that the red squirrel figurehead of the ship seemed like a sign of protection to him, since a red squirrel was also a symbol of the Gilbert household. Or simply that he falsely believed that even though the Squirrel was the smallest of his ships, he believed that she was safer because of how much better she maneuvered compared to his larger ships. No matter what the reason was, on the 9th of September, in the middle of a large storm off the Azores Islands, the men on board the Golden Hind saw Gilbert sitting in the stern of his little ship with a book in hand. For a moment, they were close enough to communicate, and Gilbert shouted to them, "We are as near to heaven by sea as by land," before they were separated again. Around midnight that night, the Golden Hind was still battling the storm, watching the lights of the Squirrel ahead of them, when all of a sudden the lights of the Squirrel disappeared. The men of the Golden Hind continued to keep a lookout for Gilbert for the rest of their voyage home, hoping they were mistaken about his fate. But there would be no more sign of the Squirrel, or Gilbert, and his large plans for the future.
For more information, please see Voyages of Drake and Gilbert by Richard Hawklight, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.